For those of you who didn't hear my explanation earlier, some of us are wearing hijab today in honor of World Hijab Day, which is coming up on Wednesday. So my sermon today is about stories. Stories have power. Stories have power to inform, educate, and inspire. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves have a huge influence over how we know the world. I love listening to National Public Radio StoryCorps program. Anybody else hear that program? Yeah. I'm often driving to work in the dark in my little Bullet, hearing the interview between two people or more who have connected to each other in some form of another. And I'm often moved to tears. And I'm changed by the time I get to work. I think about my own relationships and what about them I might like to share, or the unasked questions I would like to ask the people in my life. Much like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof when he asks, "But Goldie, do you love me?" Asking another person the deep questions of life. That's what StoryCorps is to me. The StoryCorps mission is to preserve and share humanity's stories in order to build connections between people and create a more just and compassionate world. We do this, the website says, to remind one another of our shared humanity, to strengthen and build the connections between people, to teach the value of listening, and to weave into the fabric of our culture the understanding of everyone's story, and that everyone's story matters. At the same time, we are creating an invaluable archive for future generations, end quote. Further, StoryCorps is built on an uncompromising commitment to excellence throughout the organization that includes an intense focus on collecting, sharing, and the preserving of people's stories, high-quality organizational management, and the care and support of extraordinary work environment where respect and dignity are paramount. And they do this in 3 ways. The interview session is at the heart of StoryCorps. We treat participants with the utmost respect, care, and dignity. StoryCorps maintains a relentless focus on serving a wide diversity of participants. StoryCorps is a public service. So imagine my surprise. On this past December 9th, for the first time I can remember, I heard a StoryCorps story that jangled me, and I've been thinking about it ever since. This particular story was part of a new project called The Great Thanksgiving Listen. And the website explains that, quote, for the second year in a row, StoryCorps invited everyone to take part in the Great Thanksgiving Listen, our effort to collect and preserve intergenerational interviews over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. And while tens of thousands of the Great Thanksgiving Listen conversations continue to be archived and listened to, one interview in particular has gotten us wondering, is it ever too late to make amends? End quote. In this story, a 94-year-old man, now ailing from Parkinson's disease, was interviewed and recorded by his son, and they submitted it to StoryCorps. In the recording, Dr. Linkst tells his story. He says, "When I was 8 years old, I was running in the schoolyard, and my arm struck the eyeglasses of one of the students, and he began to cry. He was going to tell his father it would cost $2 to fix the glasses, and I was frightened to death. Where was I going to get $2? We had a cleaning lady by the name of Pearl, a black woman, and I knew that every week she'd get $2 for her services. On this particular day, I was terrified. I took the $2 and took it to the teacher and settled the problem of the broken glasses. When Pearl finished her day's work, she went for the $2, and they weren't there. And my mother said there was no question that Pearl took the $2 and didn't admit it. And my mother was so angry that she told Pearl not to come back anymore. And then the word leaked out that Pearl was a thief, and Pearl couldn't get another job, and she had several children. I was the only one who knew the true story. I didn't tell anyone, and I was smitten with grief at what I had done. I kept that secret until the age of 94, which is hard to believe, but the event never left me. The StoryCorps website makes the following statement about the story. This is only half the story. Dr. Links doesn't remember Pearl's last name and doesn't know what happened to her family. That's where you come in. Considering Dr. Links' Atlantic City origin, if you have information regarding Pearl or someone related to her, please email StoryCorps. I found the story so disturbing that I wanted to follow up on it when I got to work. 15 minutes later, in that short time, the amateur genealogists were on it in their effort to find the identity of Miss Pearl, and sides had been drawn as to whether Dr. Links was a hero or a villain. StoryCorps had even posted a warning, and remember, this is 15 minutes later. StoryCorps had even posted a warning that some posts had to be deleted due to their inappropriate nature. In this slide, you can see one earnest helper and the NPR response. The NPR response is, "We plan to stay on this," but I was unable to find such an update to this story. Another post includes a possible last name for Miss Pearl. The post says, "I will look at the U.S. Census for 1930 and see if I can find an African-American woman with a first name Pearl in Atlantic City who worked as a domestic servant. I think it may be possible to find her last name." And then a couple of hours later, someone else says, "Pearl Garrison had at least one child and listed her employment as servant to a family, as well as a Pearl Jacobs. I didn't see a lot that had children living with them, but as others have said, they could have been living elsewhere." Some folks were moved by what they identified as a heartwarming story. And this post says, "The comments on this story are so negative. This man was 8 years old. You can't judge the character of a man by the choices he made at 8. He grew up in a time without internet. He didn't know her last name. I'm sure he had no idea where to start trying to track her down. Give him a break." Some folks didn't see it that way at all. One person writes, "I feel worse having read this. Just another reminder how unjust the world is. A man given all the advantages in life and now on his deathbed finally parts with the secret that potentially hurt this family's livelihood for generations. It's a yucky feeling reading this. I think if this family was ever found, it would just cause hurt and resentment. Leave them alone." And another person, "Really, NPR? We should help him rather than help Pearl and her family? I would ask you to investigate why you didn't see this from Pearl's perspective instead of asking her family to absolve him of his. He's had an entire long lifetime to make this right and didn't. There were 1,500 comments that went back and forth. The posts were arguing with each other, and nothing resolved from NPR. I looked all over the StoryCorps website, looked on the Facebook page, and there's nothing. And then the posts just stop. This was delivered originally on December 9th, and the posts stop on December 10th. So I don't know if they just cut it off or what happened, but I was unable to find a resolution. Last week, while we were in D.C. for the Women's March, we had the great pleasure, thanks to Mary Rothschild, of visiting the National Museum of African American History. It's an astonishingly beautiful building, and the artifacts of the history of slavery in this country are compelling. One sobering exhibit in the museum is the Emmett Till casket and story. In September of 1955, the white woman Carolyn Bryant told a story that resulted in the brutal murder of the 14-year-old Emmett Till. She reported that, quote, while she was unable to utter the unprintable word he had used, as one of the defense lawyers put it, he said he had done something with white women before. Then she added, I was just scared to death, end quote. In a new book by Timothy B. Tyson, we find out about Miss Bryant's story. He writes, down through the decades, Carolyn Bryant Donham, she would divorce, then remarry twice more, was a mystery woman. An attractive mother of 2 young boys, she had spent approximately 1 minute alone with Till before, in the view of others, the alleged whistling occurred. He may not have whistled because he was said to have had a lisp. Carolyn then dropped out of sight, never speaking to the media about the incident. But she is hidden no more. In a new book titled The Blood of Emmett Till, Timothy Tyson, a Duke University senior research scholar, reveals that Carolyn, in 2007, at the age of 72, confessed that she had fabricated most of the sensational part of her testimony. That part's not true, she told Tyson about her claim that Till had made verbal and physical advances on her. As for the rest of what happened that evening in the country store, she said she couldn't remember. Carolyn is now 82, and her current whereabouts have been kept secret by her family, end quote. So the stories we tell each other about ourselves and about our history are powerful, and they have consequences. On Friday, for example, Mr. Trump signed an executive order that severely restricts immigration from 7 Muslim countries, suspends all refugee admission for 120 days, and bars all Syrian refugees indefinitely. In it, he also ordered that Christians and others from minority religions be granted priority over Muslims. And he justified his actions by telling a story about how Christians have been treated. In an interview, he explained to an interviewer for the Christian Broadcasting Network that, quote, Christians in Syria were horribly treated, and alleged that under previous administrations, if you were a Muslim, you could come in, but if you were Christian, it was almost impossible. I thought it was very, very unfair, so we are going to help them, end quote. In fact, the United States accepts tens of thousands of Christian refugees, according to the Pew Research Center. Almost as many Christian refugees were admitted as Muslim refugees in the 2016 fiscal year. So those stories have power, and it seems to me we can learn to follow some wisdom that people find in 12-step programs, in which one of the steps states, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all, and made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Dr. Lynx could have courageously told his story without naming Miss Pearl's name and focused instead on his own guilt. I don't hold the 8-year-old boy accountable for those actions, but maybe his mother's act to protect her 8-year-old boy. But what about the 18-year-old or the 28-year-old or the 38-year-old man who continued to keep his secret? In telling his story, he says that, quote, word got out about her theft, unquote. But really, it was his mother who spreads the word initially. It had to be the mother, right? We can imagine Miss Pearl's life after that event, unable to find work for how long? This happened in the mid-1930s. Undoubtedly, this event had a terrible impact on her life and the lives of her children. Not to mention the psychological damage of being accused wrongly of something so terrible. One wonders also if his mother knew the truth, but chose to save the reputation of her son instead of holding him accountable for his actions. I know in my family, my brothers and I were always the first to be suspected of any such wrongdoing. So there was a time in his life when, yes, absolutely, he could have made amends to Miss Pearl and her family. But at 94 years old, so many years later, it's too late, and he should have taken this story to his grave. And so I also hold National Public Radio and StoryCorps accountable for picking that story out of, they say they got thousands of submissions. Why that one? How does it get through? I'm holding them accountable as well. What about this thing called courage? The Buddhist philosophy about courage is that developing the quality of courage is essential to achieving anything in our lives. Courage is required before we can take action in any endeavor, and it is courageous people in every field who tend to achieve their goals and realize their dreams. Courage, however, is not always heroic action in a time of danger. It can consist of the persistent, unglamorous effort to do what we feel is right. While I was preparing this sermon, I kept thinking about, it's so depressing. How am I going to get out from underneath this? But as I was watching the news, I heard a story of courage that is an attempt to set things right. In LaGrange, Georgia, 77 years ago, Mr. Austin Calloway, a black man, was dragged from his cell by a band of masked men and murdered. And on this Thursday night, the LaGrange police chief, Louis M. Deckmar, who is white, told a crowd at a traditionally African-American church, quote, "I sincerely regret and denounce the role our police department played in Austin's lynching, both through our action and our inaction, and for that, I'm profoundly sorry. It should never have happened," end quote. He also said that, quote, "all citizens had the right to expect that their police department be honest, decent, unbiased, and ethical," end quote. So I say, stay the course, my friends. Stay the course. Moral courage is the courage to take action for moral reasons, even in the face of consequences. Blessed be.